Hello and welcome back to another video. If you missed my last video, we were talking about wildlife photography and photographing subjects in a cluttered woodland. That'll pop up just here. This time though, we're changing from the telephoto to the wide angle, and we're going to talk about landscape photography and whether it's possible to create long exposure images, good quality website portfolio worthy long exposure pictures without the necessary ND filters. Can we do it with multiple exposures instead? I'm going to head down to this beach over here and we'll find some subjects to shoot. Okay, so why am I doing this? Well, at the moment I find myself filterless. Had a recent lens upgrade on my wide angle and my filter thread went from 77mm to 82, meaning that my two go-to filters, my polarizer and my ND 6-stop, have become useless. And that got me thinking, how necessary really is my 6-stop ND? I only use it for long exposures around sunset and sunrise. Could I create the same thing with multiple exposures and combining those in Photoshop rather than spending 150 quid on a good filter? Do we go in? Well, luckily for this video, I can be quite stupid sometimes. And when I was in Japan in 2019, I took 2 weeks driving around the country and I left my filters at home. Now there were only 2 occasions where I wanted a long exposure, and so I had to problem solve, and I shot 2 time lapses, and since then these 2 time lapses have sat on my hard drive unedited, but they're 2 perfect data sets to do some experimenting on and see what we can find out about combining images to create motion. First up, let's talk about the motion of water, and I'll hand over to me behind the computer to compare them and to explain in about 40 seconds. Go. The patterns in waves and ripples is essentially random, and so if you combine enough images you will average out that motion. This is what creates a long exposure look. Now if we look at a single frame of the time lapse, you can see that there's a lot of detail in the water because it was captured at a fast shutter speed. So when we step up to 5 images, it doesn't look much better than 1, it just looks slightly messier. It's the same story at 10 images, but slightly smoother. And then at 20 images, it's really starting to smooth out, and we also get an effect which I quite like. If we look closer at the water, you can see flecks of detail within the smoothed out motion. It's almost like brush strokes or a painting. And then at 75 images, this is the closest I got to a proper long exposure look. Right, there's noises, we're leaving. Oh, and so there we go. With the motion of water, I needed 75 images when I used a fast shutter speed in order to blur out all that motion. But interestingly, only by 20 images I had an effect which I quite liked and which wouldn't be possible with an ND filter. So that's something to keep in mind. But it does pose the main question of the day, which is, if I can slow down the shutter speed in the camera by shooting at sunset and sunrise, can I create more blur in each frame and therefore need less images to create a convincing long exposure? Well, before we answer that, let's throw back to the computer and see what we found out about the motion of clouds. Interestingly, clouds look better with fewer images than water did, but bear in mind that with water you're trying to average out all the motion, whereas with clouds you're trying to stretch it out over time, and those are very different things. If we take a look at a single frame of the time lapse, the part you want to pay attention to is the lower right hand corner of the clouds. That's where the most detail is. So let's combine 5 images just taken 1 second apart, and you'll start to see the long exposure effect, the dragging out of the clouds. It looks good, but the clouds haven't gone far in 5 seconds. So let's extend the amount of time. Let's do 5 images taken 30 seconds apart and see how that looks. Okay, so that looks good because the distance covered by the clouds is greater, and so the long exposureness of the image is enhanced. But you're going to run into the first issue here because they're taken 30 seconds apart. There's a stepping effect in the clouds. And that's because there's a gap between where the cloud was in one frame and where it is in the next frame. Now when we go to 10 images taken just a second apart, we remove that stepping effect and we get a good amount of motion in the clouds, but still it's only 10 seconds. So if we combine all of the 45 images taken, we'll get the closest thing to a proper long exposure. Okay, great. So that's the answer to clouds. The key is to not leave a big gap in between where the cloud is in one frame to where it is in the next frame. So now that we know those two things, let's address the question of the day, shutter speed. So that brings me to being out today in this lovely weather. It's just started raining, but maybe that'll add something to the picture. But we've still got some experimenting to do with the shutter speed, because both of those time lapses are with quick shutter speeds that froze motion. But if you're out at sunset or sunrise, or on a horrible day like today, you'll find you can get a shutter speed much closer to around 1/6 of a second. So I'm going to shoot a series at 1/6 of a second, and we'll see how much blurring we can get in the motion of the water and how that helps with creating a long exposure from lots of pictures. Well, one frame at 1/6 of a second looks like this. Wow, well, today has gone from lovely weather to horrible, and now we've got a double rainbow behind me. So we're getting some motion in the picture there. But just in case that isn't enough, we're going to push past the camera's optimum settings. We're going to go right down to the minimum aperture. We're going to go down into the low range of the ISO, and that should push the shutter speed to about 1 second. Now at 1 second, we're going to get a lot more motion. Here's one frame. And now if I shoot 25 frames, we'll be able to compare all of these different shutter speeds and see which one gives us the most effective long exposure for the least amount of images. Because that's what I'm after, doing the least amount of work in Photoshop. Right, so let's bring up both of those stacks at 5 images. We can see that at 1/6 of a second, 5 images is not enough to create a convincing long exposure look. It's got its own effect, but there's still too much detail in each frame to average out cleanly. Over at the 1 second combination, the effect is similar to that of 20 images at the fast shutter speed from earlier. It's definitely starting to look like a good long exposure, but it has some level of detail still there. Then at 10 frames, both of the combinations are improving really well. Once we get to 15 frames, the 1/6 of a second blend is looking believable as a good long exposure. The 1 second exposures here are definitely providing a really strong, clean result. And so finally at 25 frames, the 1/6 of a second combination here is looking kind of like the 1 second did at 5 frames. I'll show you that one. Whereas the 1 second exposures now are looking really, really clean. If I saw this, I would expect it to have been taken with a 10 stop, and I wouldn't really question it. So what can we sum up from all of this testing and take out into the field to actually put into use? Well, it's apparent now that if your goal is an effect of minutes long exposures, then you're really going to need to slow the camera down as much as possible. You're going to need to use the smallest aperture of your lens, and you're going to run right down into the lowest ISO range. And then take as many pictures as you think your computer can handle stitching together. That will provide the best results. But another takeaway from this, and one which is more important for the way that I shoot, is that this technique created an effect all of its own, one which is unlike that of an ND filter long exposure. Let's call it the painterly effect, and it was available at all the different shutter speeds that were used in this video. It just required a different amount of images to be stitched together. So I now know that I can shoot at my camera's optimum settings. I don't have to push past them. I can shoot at f9 or f11 for sharpness, and I can shoot at my base ISO. If the shutter speed that my camera then spits out is fast enough to freeze the motion, then I know I need 20 to 30 images to make it work. If the shutter speed is going to bring some motion into the picture but not enough to remove much detail, then I'm going to need around 15 images. And then if I shoot at a darker time of day, dawn or dusk, and I can get my exposure to be a second or even 2 seconds, then I may only need 5 images to get a really nice effect. Great, so I think that's all the information we need to know. I'll now head out either at sunrise or sunset and we'll find a nice local location and see if we can put this technique into action and shoot a proper, nice, website-worthy long exposure using this technique. See you then.
Okay, so we're back out again. It's sunset, and although it doesn't look like it's going to be a very colourful one, we're actually facing directly away from sunset. But I'm hoping that this little sliver on the horizon will get some light to it. Right, so the colour in the sky did not stick around. It's gone, but that's okay. I think the feel for this image is going to be very grey, tinted towards blue, very minimal, simplistic image. It's really why you want to shoot a long exposure. You want to remove detail. You want to make the image as minimal as possible. So we're going to lean into that. And here's the shot. As you can see, this is exposed for pretty much the entire scene, but I can drop down to a second. And although the sky is going to be too bright, the foreground and the rocks is going to be just to the right hand side of the histogram, but not quite blown out. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. So let's take one frame. There we go, lots of movement in the water. I would wait even longer and get shutter speeds of maybe 2 seconds if I could, but my way back is across here. And it's very dependent on there not being water here. So I think I've got about 15 minutes before the tide's too high to get back. So I'm going to start shooting now. We'll jump straight to the final image and you can see how it turned out. If you're interested in how the actual Photoshop side of sticking these images together and getting them to blend, how that works, then stick around for the last 5 minutes of the video and I'll explain everything there, okay? Great, hope you enjoyed the video and I hope this technique comes in useful at some point. And okay, enjoy the final picture.
Okay, so that came out really nicely. I'm very happy with the shot, but you may be interested in how exactly this works inside Photoshop, how you implement this technique. So I've already separated my files from the batch that I shot on the day. I've selected the 5 that I want to merge together, and we are going to open those into Photoshop. Now for me, this will open it in Camera Raw, because these are all RAW files. You could be coming at this through Lightroom, or you could have already edited the files and exported them as JPEGs and then stitched them together after. So here are the 5 files that I've decided to merge together. You can see I've already made some basic adjustments. I've brought the vibrance down and the exposure slightly and the highlights because the sky was too bright. I've also applied a gradient filter to the sky to bring that in a bit more. Okay, and then we're going to open all 5 of those as their own pictures in Photoshop. Okay, so once all 5 are open, the easiest thing to do is to go to File, Automate and Photo Merge. And then we're going to select the files that are already open and we're going to deselect blend the images together. All we want Photoshop to do is to put them onto one file and to align them all. Now with this image in particular, Photoshop doesn't want to align them. I'm not really sure why, but as I shot it on a tripod, a sturdy tripod that wasn't having much problem with the wind, I know that they're all going to be aligned anyway. And so I'm just going to select each of the canvases and put them all onto one file. Now if you'd done the automate process, we would be at the same point now. We'd have 5 files all in the same frame. So we're going to select those files, we're going to right click on them and then select convert to smart object. Depending on whether you're using particularly large files or just JPEGs, this can take a little bit of time. But once it's done, we should have a single layer in the layers panel with the little smart object sign next to it. Now at this point, Photoshop has stacked all of those files on top of each other, but it doesn't know how to merge them. So we're going to go up to the layers panel, into the smart object menu, down to stack mode, and we're going to change it to mean. So we'll select that one and then let Photoshop do its magic for a second, and then we'll have a blend, a perfect average of those 5 frames. Okay, looking good. If we zoom in, the water's looking smooth with those flecks of detail that I wanted. But can you spot the problem? Yeah, we have the stepping effect in the clouds. Now this happened because I was concentrated on the waves. If we look at this rock, I wanted the water to be rolling off that rock in most of the pictures, so that when they were averaged out it was still there. But that meant that when I shot, I left 2 or 3 seconds between each image. The clouds are moving particularly fast, and so we've got a gap between where the clouds were in each frame. This really isn't the end of the world because I didn't want the long exposure look in the sky. I would rather show a single frame where the clouds look detailed and moody above the island. And so what we're going to do is jump to the final frame of the sequence. We're going to grab the whole file, Control C and Control V, and so we now have that file stacked on top of our merged file. But I only want the sky to show, so we're going to use a mask here. I'm going to click on the little mask icon. If you don't understand masks already, basically where the mask is white, your layer will show, and where it's black, your layer won't show. So the first thing I'm going to do is invert the layer mask. Okay, I use Control I for that. And you can see that the layer turned black and now our image disappeared. So that should show you basically how masks work. We're going to change to the gradient tool, which you can do in the toolbar on the left, or you can just click the key G. And we're going to make sure that our gradient is moving from white to black, and it's on this setting up here. And so we're going to move onto the horizon. We're going to click just above the horizon, and we're going to hold shift so that the gradient we make is straight, and we're going to drag down to the bottom of the island. Okay, once we let go, you can see that the layer mask now has a slither of white up top, and that corresponds to just the sky area. So our sky shows through on top of our blend, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So from this point, I'm going to crop and then do some final colour and contrast adjustments. If you're particularly interested in how this got from the original raw files through the colouring process to get this final file, then let me know in the comments, and that's something that I'll address when I make more videos in the future. So that's the final image. I'm really happy with how it came out, and hopefully this technique can come in useful for you at some point too. I know it will for me if I'm over filterless, or if I just need this specific effect in an image. If you want to see more of my work, I've got a link to my website and my socials down in the description. It's right next to the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks again.